guys, this is Stone Cold Tech Support, and before we get into today's video, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who has subscribed. We have reached over 300 subscribers at this point, and I just want to thank you all. So yeah, now let's get to it. Today we have the Gigabyte RTX 2070 Super Gaming OC for review. This was actually a gift from me to my girlfriend, so she had the honor of doing the initial unboxing. Apart from the card, there is not really anything exciting to speak of in the box, so we'll just move on to the card itself. I'm sure most of you are already familiar with the 2070 Super. This particular model has an advertised clock speed of 1815 MHz, but GPU boost will undoubtedly go beyond that. This is the white model. There is of course also a black one, which is pretty much identical apart from the color. And the cooling solution consists of three 82mm fans with a fan stop feature, and the middle one spins in the opposite direction. It also has a beefy heatsink with 6 heat pipes that are in direct contact with the GPU, and the backplate is made of metal and also appears to aid in cooling the memory. Unlike the ASRock RTX 2060 Super I looked at in the past, the only RGB effect here is the Gigabyte logo, and I think it looks rather good, to be honest. When it comes to display outputs, the card has a fairly standard layout of 3 DisplayPorts and 1 HDMI, in addition to the Virtual Link USB-C port. The card measures 286.5mm long, 114.4mm tall, and 50.2mm thick, and it weighs in at 983 grams, so just shy of 1 kilogram. If you want to overclock, be aware that the power limiter stops at 111%. I was only able to add 100 MHz to the core clock, but this will of course vary depending on the silicon lottery. The memory on this model was Micron, and I was able to add 800 MHz to the memory in Afterburner. So let's get it on the test bench and see how it performs. We start off with temperature. When running Firestrike Ultra Stress Test, the Gigabyte RTX 2070 Super Gaming OC peaked at 44.5 degrees Celsius over ambient, which would result in a temperature of 66.5 degrees Celsius with an ambient temperature of 22 degrees. This is 5.5 Celsius cooler than the Zotac twin fan model. Now let's see what the fan speed the card needed to achieve this temperature was. Under load, the fan speed was 1550 RPM, about 350 RPM slower than the fans on the Zotac twin fan model. At idle, the fans on the Gaming OC shuts off and therefore makes no noise at all. And I should also mention that when the fans spin up, they sort of overshoot their set RPM. Next up is noise. Noise level is measured 30 centimeters away from the fans, and at idle the card does not contribute to the noise at all, so we can ignore that number. Under load we achieve a result of 40 dBA, a good result, around 6 dBA quieter than the Zotac twin fan model, which is noticeable. Now let's look at power draw. Power draw is measured using a Corsair RM1000i power supply, and here we are looking at power out on the 12-volt rail while running Firestrike Ultra, and the Gigabyte RTX 2070 Super only hit 273 watts. I had to retest several times as this is almost 60 watts less than the Zotac twin fan model, which is only running reference clock speeds. So this also means that the Gigabyte RTX 2070 Super is consuming less power than the ASRock RTX 2060 Super in this test. Overclocking increases the consumption to 306 watts, but still less than the Zotac twin fan model. Now, kicking things off with Battlefield 5 at 1080p with DirectX 11, the Gigabyte RTX 2070 Super Gaming OC did 130.3 frames per second on average, 1% faster than the Zotac model and 12% ahead of the 2060 Super, but 12% behind the Strix 5700 XT, even though the 0.1% low is much better on the 2070 Super. In 1440p, the Gaming OC did 95.1 frames per second on average, again beating out the Zotac model by a single percent. It is 13% faster than the 2060 Super though, but still lags behind the Strix 5700 XT by 15%. In 4K, this model did 56 frames per second on average, closer to 2% ahead of the Zotac model this time, while still being 13% ahead of the 2060 Super, but the 5700 XT's lead is now cut in half, so this time it's only 7% faster. Next game is Control. At 1080p, the gaming OC did 105.6 frames per second on average, coming in at the same performance as the Zotac model and 9% ahead of the Strix 5700 XT, while being 12% ahead of the 2060 Super. If we move up to 1440p, the White Knight came in at 68 frames per second, coming in 2% behind the Zotac model, but still 10 to 11% ahead of the 2060 Super and 5700 XT. In 4K, we are down to 33.8 frames per second on average, coming in 10% ahead of the 2060 Super and now 13% ahead of the 5700 XT. Moving on to Devil May Cry 5 at 1080p, the 2070 Super gaming OC did 185.6 frames per second on average, coming in 3% ahead of the Zotac model and 7% ahead of the Strix 5700 XT. All that while being 14% ahead of the 2060 Super. Cranking the resolution up to 1440p, and this card did 121.6 frames per second on average, coming in 5% ahead of both the Zotac model and the 5700 XT Strix model, while being 14% faster than the 2060 Super. In 4K, the Gigabyte model is on par with the Zotac model at 64.6 frames per second on average, beating out the Strix 5700 XT by 6% and the 2060 Super by 15%. Now let's look at performance in the Division 2. Here the Gigabyte 2070 Super did 112.8 frames per second on average, 2% behind the Zotac model, but 11% ahead of the Strix 5700 XT and 15% ahead of the 2060 Super. Moving things up to 1440p, and the Gigabyte model now does 74.7 frames per second on average, again being 2% behind the Zotac model, but still 6% ahead of the 5700 XT Strix model and 14% ahead of the 2060 Super. If we move things up further to 4K, the Gigabyte model now did 37.8 frames per second on average, coming in 6% behind the Zotac model, which seems a bit off, but these are the average of 3 runs, so it's not a one-off result either. In any case, it's still 3% ahead of the 5700 XT Strix and 8% ahead of the 2060 Super. Next up is Forza Horizon 4, and at 1080p, the Gigabyte model managed 159.7 frames per second on average, coming in 2% ahead of the Zotac model and the Strix 5700 XT, while being a full 16% ahead of the 2060 Super. Moving things up to 1440p, this card did 129.1 frames per second on average, again 2% ahead of the Zotac model, 3% ahead of the Strix 5700 XT, and 18% faster than the 2060 Super. At 4K, the Gigabyte 2070 Super did 85 frames per second on average, a single percent ahead of the Zotac model, but 4% ahead of the Strix 5700 XT and 18% ahead of the 2060 Super. The next game on our list is Gears of War 5, and in 1080p, the Gigabyte model did 104.7 frames per second on average, which puts it about 2% behind the Zotac model and 6% behind the Strix 5700 XT. It is, however, still 7% ahead of the 2060 Super. In 1440p, the Gigabyte model did 75.1 frames per second on average, which is on par with the Zotac model and just 3% behind the 5700 XT Strix, but 17% ahead of the 2060 Super. In 4K, the Gigabyte model has overtaken the Strix 5700 XT at 41.9 frames per second on average, being 2% ahead of the Strix and Zotac 2070 Super and 9% ahead of the 2060 Super. Now let's move on to Ghost Recon Breakpoint. At 1080p, the Gigabyte RTX 2070 Super gaming OC did 70.2 frames per second on average, as near as makes no difference to the Zotac model and the Strix 5700 XT, but a healthy 16% lead over the 2060 Super. Increasing the resolution to 1440p decreases performance to 50.6 frames per second on average, and again it is within a single frame of the Zotac and the 5700 XT Strix model, while being 15% faster than the 2060 Super. In 4K then, the Gigabyte model is out on top, while the Strix 5700 XT is brought to its knees. Next up is Rainbow Six Siege, and here at 1080p, the Gigabyte 2070 Super did 204.2 frames per second on average, coming in 3% ahead of the Zotac model, 4% ahead of the Strix 5700 XT, and 10% ahead of the 2060 Super. Now increasing the resolution to 1440p, and here the gaming OC did 132.2 frames per second on average, 4% ahead of the Zotac model, 6% ahead of the 5700 XT, and 19% ahead of the 2060 Super. At 4K then, the gaming OC did 68.4 frames per second on average, coming in 2% ahead of the Zotac model, 18% ahead of the 5700 XT, which seems to be performing poorly at 4K, and 14% ahead of the 2060 Super. Now we move on to Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and at 1080p the gaming OC did 113.5 frames per second on average, an unusual 7% ahead of the Zotac model and 5700 XT Strix, while being 17% faster than the 2060 Super. At 1440p the Gigabyte model did 76.8 frames per second on average, again an unusual 6% ahead of the Zotac model, 9% ahead of the Strix 5700 XT, and 18% ahead of the 2060 Super. In 4K then, the Gigabyte model did 41.6 frames per second on average, beating out the Zotac model by 9%, crushing the 5700 XT by 15%, and 2060 Super by 21%. Now the last game we're looking at is The Witcher 3, and at 1080p the Gigabyte 2070 Super did 137.9 frames per second on average, which is on par with the Zotac model, 17% ahead of the 5700 XT Strix, and 9% ahead of the 2060 Super. At 1440p then, the Gigabyte model did 92.5 frames per second on average, now being 3% ahead of the Zotac model, 8% ahead of the 5700 XT Strix, and 9% ahead of the 2060 Super. And at 4K, the gaming OC came in at 51.2 frames per second on average, pretty much the same as the Zotac model, but 12% ahead of the 2060 Super and 5700 XT Strix. Now let's take a quick look at some overclocked numbers in a few games at 1440p. First off, The Witcher 3, and with the overclock, the Gigabyte model did 100 frames per second on average, 2% behind the overclocked Zotac model, but 10% ahead of the 2060 Super and 5700 XT overclocked. In Rainbow Six Siege, the Gigabyte model did 140.2 frames per second on average, 2% ahead of the overclocked Zotac model this time, 5% in front of the 5700 XT overclocked, and 13% ahead of the overclocked 2060 Super. And lastly, Gears of War 5, here the Gigabyte model did 82.4 frames per second on average when overclocked, about 3% ahead of the overclocked Zotac model, on par with the overclocked 5700 XT Strix, and 19% faster than the overclocked 2060 Super. The average performance gain from overclocking is 8%. Now we'll take a quick look at a couple of ray tracing benchmark, and I won't get too much into these numbers, but it is slightly faster than the Zotac model, apart from in Control, where it is pretty much identical. When we look at the relative performance across the 10 games tested, this model is slightly ahead of the Zotac Twin Fan model and Strix 5700 XT, but the differences aren't too much. Now let's look at watt per FPS, and this is interesting. So while running The Witcher 3, we achieved 3.6 watts per FPS at stock speeds, and the same after the overclock, and that is impressive efficiency. Price to performance was challenging. When I was looking up the prices on this model, it was out of stock on Newegg and had a price of $550. Where I am located, it costs the same as the black model, and therefore I will use the price of the black model for the price to performance numbers. So you are paying $5.66 per average FPS in 1440p with this model, about the same as the Aorus 2060 Super and slightly more than the Zotac Twin Fan model. The 5700 XT Strix though is better value, even though it is one of the most expensive 5700 XTs. Now to grade the card, so the noise level was 40 dBA, which results in a B in the noise category. Temperature was a very good 44.5 Celsius over ambient, and that results in an A. Build quality is the most subjective grade, and here I'm hovering between a B and a C. Ultimately though, I feel like this is a solid C. Overall though, I have no issues recommending this card. It would even be highly recommended. And maybe I need a highly recommended award. I'm very, very happy with this, and I think my girlfriend is going to be as well. In any case, this is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and happy shopping this Black Friday. Farewell.